I would like to introduce you to Ken Wall, a very godly man and my dad.
Today is Saturday, July the 4th, 2026. Well, last week, I promised you that Naomi finally had a plan up her sleeve. And what a plan it was. Naomi sent Ruth down to the threshing floor in the middle of the night and told her to wait until Boaz had eaten and laid down. And then in Ruth chapter 3, verse 4, she gave Ruth these instructions. When he lies down, note the place where he was lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Now, I've got to be honest with you. I became a Christian when I was in grade 5 at the age of 10. And over these many years that have passed, I have read the book of Ruth many times, and I never realized how some scholars have interpreted Ruth 3 verse 4. When I first read that verse as a child, all I thought was that uncovering Boaz's feet was designed to wake him up by giving him cold feet. Other than that, I just breezed right past that. Now that I'm taking this course at a master's level, I started digging into the books that I read in Ruth, plus looking at many commentaries. By doing so, I realized that this little verse has caused such a great stir among various scholars, and it all boils down to this. Did they have sex or didn't they? So I've titled these next two videos, Sex or No Sex. This week is part 1, and next week is part 2. Today I'm going to give you the scholars who say that this was a sexual encounter on the threshing floor. Next week in part 2, I'll give you the scholars, and frankly my own view, that say no, that this was something else entirely. Fair is fair. So let's look at what the first camp says. I'm going to look at 2 of the books from my course on the book of Ruth and an article entitled Indecent Proposal by Charles Halton. All 3 of these authors take the position that hanky-panky occurred and they didn't tiptoe around it. The first scholar is Daniel Hawk, and Hawk looks at the Hebrew verbs in this passage, the words for uncover and feet and lie down. He says, when you put them all together, they are, and I'm quoting him here, sexually suggestive. He says each one of these words occurs as a common idiom for sexual intercourse. Now stay with me because it gets bolder. Hawk says that the phrase under his feet is actually an idiom, a polite cover word for the male genitalia. And then he comes right out and says it in his reading. Naomi's whole plan was, and I quote, seduction and entrapment to get Ruth pregnant. Well now, that's quite a different bedtime story than the one I grew up with. The second scholar in this camp is Judy Fentress Williams, and she sees the very same thing. She asks the question right out loud. Do Naomi's instructions tell Ruth to make sure she's, in her words, sexually attractive? Fentress Williams said that the phrase, to know where he lies, is an obvious wordplay for sexual intimacy. And just like Hawk, she says that uncovering Boaz's feet is a euphemism, a polite stand-in word for his genitals. She even brings in the word threshing itself and says that threshing is a metaphor for sexual intercourse and fertility. So in her reading, the very setting, the threshing floor at harvest time, is loaded with meaning. Now, Fentress Williams adds one more piece, and this is where she really builds her case. She points out that the book of Ruth is deliberately, intentionally linked to 2 other stories in the Bible. 2 stories that I'll just say are not exactly Sunday school favorites. On Ruth's side, there's her ancestor Lot and his daughters. And on Boaz's side, there's his ancestor Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. Both of these are stories where a woman takes matters into her own hands to secure an heir. and both involve, shall we say, a private encounter. So Fenchers Williams is saying, look at the family tree on both sides. And Samuel, the prophet who is the author of Ruth, wants you to hear these echoes. That last point, the business of linking Ruth back to Lot's daughters and to Tamar, I think that is simply wild speculation. You can disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine, but I'll explain why I think that next week. Lastly, let's look at what Halton said in his article, Indecent Proposal. Halton takes a view that many commentators have sanitized Ruth 3 by denying the obvious sexual overtones. Halton claims that Naomi intentionally devised a plan for sexual entrapment in order to secure redemption for her and Ruth. Naomi hoped Ruth would place Boaz in a compromising situation so that he would be obligated to marry Ruth. These three authors believe that almost every word in Ruth 3 gets read as a euphemism for something sexual. I start to wonder whether they are reading the text or reading something into the text. I also think Hawk, Fentress, Williams, and Halton have way too much sex on their minds. Now, I don't say that to be cute. These are serious, careful scholars, and they've earned the right to be heard, which is exactly why I gave them a fair hearing today. In closing, I find it sad that the lovely story of Ruth, for some modern scholars, pivots it to a shameful, sordid affair. This account leaves a bad taste in my mouth. They see Naomi as a villainess, Ruth as a seductress, and Boaz as one who is easily fooled into committing fornication with Ruth. Next week, I'm going to show you why I believe this midnight visit had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with Ruth, who is one humble, noble woman who placed herself completely under the protection of Boaz, who was an honorable man, and ultimately under the wings of Almighty God. So in the meantime, read Ruth chapter 3 and bring an open mind to what I'm going to be saying next week. Then you can make up your mind as to what is the correct interpretation of Ruth 3, specifically Ruth 3 verse 4. May the good Lord be with you until we meet again next week.